Good evening to everyone. Today we have among us someone who has worked as a senior journalist, a public servant, and is now a very fine public intellectual at large who regularly writes about India's challenges and solutions. We have Mr. Sanjaya Baru with us. He has served as the editor of Economic Times, the Financial Express, and the Business Standard, and was also former PM Manmohan Singh's media advisor. Mr. Sanjay Baru, welcome to a discussion with our reading community, Readers Cafe.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I would like to tell the audience that organizing today's session depicts the power of art of the possible in some way. For it was a chance encounter with Mr. Baru at his book signing event at a bookshop that has led to today's discussion being organized. And Mr. Baru was kind enough to accept our invitation to talk about his recent book, India's Power Elite, which is a study of the history and the changing composition of India's power establishment at the national and the regional level. Mr. Baru, the first 30 minutes we can organize in the form of certain questions that I had after reading the book. And after that, we can open the floor for 15 minutes to the audience who will put forward their questions. So, Mr. Baru, let's start with a very fundamental question that puzzles the readers in general, including me, that how does an author decide the topic on which he or she will write? To make it more specific, how did you, as someone who has expertise in political economy, journalism, national security, arrive at the decision of writing about India's power establishment?
Actually, that's an easy question to answer. I've been thinking of writing this book for a long time. I mentioned at the very beginning of the book that when I was very young, when I was a college student, I was impressed by a famous classic called The Power Elite, written by an American sociologist, C. Wright Mills. And, I've read it and reread it many times, particularly after I came to New Delhi and was in the media and in the government. But what really triggered me into writing this was the fact that, we had this very interesting political discussion going on in Delhi, where the Narendra Modi and his supporters have been attacking what they call Lutyens Delhi. And the political objective they set out was to create a Congress Mukt Bharat. So the politics of the country had become one of clash between two power centers, if you like. And many people have written, in the media over the last few years about what exactly this political tension has all been about. But I felt that it's time to look at it more systematically, and then I gave the book a certain historical dimension by going into the past and seeing how this transition of India's power elite has happened over the last half a century.
Okay. So the idea was always in the pipeline, just that the politics of last few years has maybe added a pace, because now we realize that the clash is a bit more energetic, strong, and sometimes a bit dangerous in the way that political parties term each other.
That's right. And which is why my book, incidentally, I should show the cover of my book to your viewers, the India's Power Elite, Class, Caste, and a Cultural Revolution. It begins by situating it in the current context. The first two chapters are devoted to what is happening now in the last few years in India. And then I go back in history over the subsequent chapters.
Well, to our benefit, sir, you undertook a novel exercise by writing about a topic that has not been discussed enough, at least in the Indian context. And my next question to you is regarding the second word of the book's subtitle, which is caste. Now, caste has always played a greater role than class in Indian politics, and the political decline of the left in the country in the last few decades, it confirms it even more strongly. So the last two general elections show that there's a greater Hindu consolidation of votes, which is kind of a strong departure from the past, vastly eliminating the political, social divide among the various castes that was exploited by, region caste-based parties, and sometimes not just exploiting, but sometimes actually fighting for their rights. So do you see that as a stepping stone, towards a less caste-conscious society, this consolidation of Hindu votes? Will this political consolidation, which is only opportunistic in its nature, for that it happens only at the time of elections, do you see that as a stepping stone towards caste being eliminated as an identity in the future?
Well, first of all, I don't agree with the proposition that class is no longer a relevant category in a society like ours. We are an extremely unequal society. Among all the major countries of the world, we have the largest number of people still living below poverty. We have the highest rate of illiteracy. We have the highest rate of malnutrition. We have the highest rate of childbirth. So we are a very, very unequal society. And the very fact of this inequality puts class right in front of us. Indian society is divided into the rich, the middle class, and the poor. The share of the poor in the total population has come down, particularly between 2000 and 2015. In those 15 years, because of high rates of economic growth, we see a sharp decline in the poverty rate. The middle class the share of middle class in the population has increased, but billionaires have also increased. India has had more billionaires than many other developing countries. In fact, sometime back it was said that India has more billionaires than China, though China is 5 times bigger than India. So inequality has increased in this country. And even through COVID, when millions of people have lost jobs, India's rich have become richer. The Ambanis and the Adanis, the top 500 business groups have all become richer. All the data is there now to show how much in the last 1 year they've all become richer. So class is very much an issue. It's a different matter that the influence of the left has gone down, left political parties has gone down, but other political parties, including the BJP. I mean, when Rahul Gandhi, and I mentioned this in my book, when Rahul Gandhi called Narendra Modi's government a suit boot ki sarkar, Modi was immediately worried of that image that he would be seen as a pro-business leader. And he went in for demonetization. He went in for all this Jam, this Jandan and Aadhaar, and a whole lot of initiatives to establish his pro-poor credentials. So class factors always operate in India. Similarly, caste. I mean, caste has endured right through the period of the Mughal rule and the British rule. I mean, it's though it is a marker of Hindu society, and we've had 1,000 years of Muslim rule and 200 years of British rule, European rule. Caste as a institution has survived. It has not gone away. And in fact, what is interesting is that even other religions have been over the, not just now, I mean, over the last several 100 years, been affected by caste. So even among Muslims, there are caste, categories. And, you have Muslim friends, they'll tell you that, who would not marry across these caste categories. Among Christians, there are Dalit Christians, and there are people who call themselves Brahmin Christians. So, caste is a very powerful institution that has survived. Now, as far as your question about Hindu consolidation as a vote bank is concerned, I think we have seen recently, for example, in Bengal elections, how the BJP was forced to use caste and subcaste factors, not just caste but subcaste, to mobilize support. When the BJP as a political party has been quite happy to use caste. In fact, I mentioned in my book, I quote Mr. Modi saying during the 2019 election that I'm a backward caste leader. I mean, he actually went around asking for votes, saying I'm from the backward caste. But I think the interesting thing, and that is what my book draws attention to, is that power has shifted, because I'm talking of the power elite. In the late 1950s, Ram Manohar Lohia wrote a very famous essay, describing the nature of India's power elite, in which he said there are three characteristics of India's power elite. First is that they are upper caste, second, that they're inherited wealth, and third, that they're all English speaking. I think on each of those parameters, things have changed. The Indian ruling class, not just in Delhi, but across the country, if you see, are no longer only the upper caste. The middle caste, the OBCs, have become very, very powerful, politically powerful, economically powerful. The wealthy are no longer only the inherited wealth, but there are new wealthy, those who have come into wealth in the last 20 years, particularly after 1991. And finally, The English speaking is not the only defining feature of the Indian power elite today. You can be Hindi speaking, or for example in Gujarat you would be Gujarat speaking and yet be a billionaire, a very wealthy and powerful person who only operates in Gujarati. So that is something which has changed. So those are the kind of changes that my book discusses.
Yes, sir. So in terms of class, what I meant is that though it's very much an existing phenomenon, we have a lot of wealth inequalities, and we are not doing particularly good when it comes to human development indices. But are the poor people in the country able to exert the requisite political weight just as various caste groups are able to? So in terms of political relevance, would you rate caste as more important than class if you have to pick one between the two?
Well, I think certainly caste has become far more important. There's no denying that. But often class differences get reflected through caste. I mean, for example, when you have someone like Mayawati representing Dalit community in Uttar Pradesh, she's also representing the poorest sections of society. So you do have parallel things, but I think you're right in suggesting that political mobilization has been more on caste than on class terms. That is true.
Right, sir. And talking about the very interesting episode wherein Mr. Rahul Gandhi called Mr. Modi's Sarkar as Soot Boot Ki Sarkar, you know, the entire change in narrative from the campaigning side of Mr. Modi, like, him entering the Jam Trinity thing and entering into other areas of, campaign, would you say that this also comes? I mean, I feel that this has got two reasons. One, that people are legitimately scared that politicians might be doing something which is crony capitalistic in nature, along with the business houses of the country. But apart from that, do you see that people fear political leaders or they reject political leaders who are pro business? And do you feel that this attitude in general that pervades the political economic climate in the country is a relic of the socialistic legacy of the country?
Well, that's a good question, but a difficult question to answer because I think, first of all, it varies from state to state. I mean, in some parts of the country, still there's a very strong anti-business sentiment that drives politics. But I think one of the interesting things, and that is there in my chapter on shifts in political power, is how in the past you had business, economically powerful and politically powerful. Today they have come together. The number of what are called crore-patis in the legislative assembly and in parliament has sharply increased over the last 10 years. The number of business people in politics and the number of politicians who have become businessmen. I mean, the intimate link between business and politics has actually become more important in the last decade. And you can see large number of politicians who were not particularly wealthy when they came into power suddenly become very, very wealthy and, across political parties. So I think what is happening is that wealth is becoming increasingly important for political power, and political power is becoming increasingly important for accumulation of wealth. And it is this link between the economically better off and the politically powerful, which one of the chapters in my book discusses.
So my next question would come from the previous answers of yours, that whenever we have a discussion at national level about political economy, there are two things that we definitely talk about. One is production part of it, and the other side is the redistribution part of it. And right from COVID vaccines to hospital services to education to anything, these two words have always dominated the narrative of an economic discussion everywhere. So, and there's a consensus in society that enough redistribution or justified redistribution can only take place when we have abundance of resources, when there is enough production to distribute the resources ahead. So how would you, or what according to you is the solution to change this Indian psyche, this Indian voters psyche, wherein we necessarily do not talk about production enough, but we talk about redistribution without realizing that we need to be a suitable free market economy along with suitable government intervention in order to ensure that there is abundance of resources. So how do we change this Indian psyche and even the political psyche, so that they openly advocate certain pro-business policies without being crony capitalistic in nature. What is the solution to this so that we have enough production to redistribute the resources justifiably and equitably?
Well, you see, first of all, it is not as much a problem of the Indian psyche as it is a problem of, as it is a consequence of the failure of the political leadership. You know, politicians talk about redistribution because they are failing to enhance production. You look at what happened between 2000 and 2014. The whole focus of political mobilization was on the fact that India was growing at the fastest rates of growth, 8% growth. And despite a lot of mistakes being made by the UPA, Manmohan Singh got a second term in 2019 because during his first term, he delivered the highest rate of economic growth since independence. In fact, for 100 years, 8% plus. And more jobs were created, more income was created. So the voter rewarded the government, the UPA, by giving it a second term, right? Um, so my view is that if the economy is doing well, voters do recognize, if the political leadership is focused on employment, on income, then redistribution doesn't become the only factor. But redistribution will remain important in India as long as you have this sharp inequality. You know, the problem of our society is inequality. That the rich have become richer in the last 20 years, the poor have become, they may not have become poorer, but certainly the inequality has increased. So therefore, politicians cannot run away from focusing on redistribution. But the real answer for India is really to sustain high rates of growth. Over say from 1950 to 1980, we had 3.5% average annual rate of growth. From 1980 to 2000, we had 5.5% average annual growth. From 2000 to 2015, we had 7.5% average annual growth. And since 2015, it's now around 6%. And this year, of course, is negative. And most forecasts are now saying that over the next few years, probably 5 or 6%. So the rate of growth has slowed down. And that is why there is once again greater focus on redistribution. The real challenge for the current government is to once again enhance the rate of investment, rate of saving, and the rate of economic growth. And people will reward that. I don't think people shy away from rewarding a government that performs.
Sure. So just to summarize the answer, sir, we necessarily are not looking forward to a very caste-ridden society because it's a powerful institution which has always prevailed, and we might not see a society in future which would see caste getting diluted. Albeit if it does, it might be diluting at a very gradual pace, at a very glacial thing. And in terms of production and redistribution, Indian voters do reward production. They do like abundance of resources, while at the same time, just as they should, they worry about redistribution due to widespread wealth inequalities in the country.
Very sad.
And more income, more employment, more output, and justifiably it would lead to a better economic situation for the country. Now, my next question is, sir, that you posit in the book that Mr. Modi's rejection of the erstwhile power elite is akin to Mao Zedong's cultural revolution in China. My understanding from this is that there is a major difference between the two. For cultural revolution was a successful attempt by Mao Zedong at solidifying his political power that was being increasingly threatened by the Communist Party insiders. Whereas Modi's, let's say, displacing or uprooting or rejecting the Indian power elite is a doctrinal phenomenon. He finds this elite to be at the core of certain governance issues, scandals, let's say, and scams, and therefore he's assisted in this endeavor by the voters of 2014 and 19 who actually voted for governance and employment and certain national issues getting resolved and the country becoming stronger. So in your opinion, apart from the outward commonality of displacement of erstwhile elite in both cultural evolution and displacement of Indian power elite, what else would you say binds the two or connects the two or makes them similar?
Well, very good question. Well, first of all, the reason I use the metaphor of the Cultural Revolution, because there are two reasons. One, the Mao used the Cultural Revolution to, in fact, weaken the power of the Beijing elite. It was essentially asking all those who were in Beijing, in government, in universities, in positions of power, to get out of the city and go into villages. They were forced to go and become farmers. They were required to live in villages, and thousands of people, highly trained, highly educated people, were sent away to the villages to work in villages. And it was a deliberate attempt to weaken the power of a class in Beijing that had not yet come to accept the Maoist revolution. The consequence of that was that it deeply hurt China's economy. It set China back by almost more than a decade, and it took a lot of repair work afterwards. The four modernizations that was launched in '79 by Chou Enlai and then taken forward by Deng Xiaoping, to bring China forward. And it's a miracle that China then marched forth so quickly that today they have become a superpower. My worry is there are a lot of what Prime Minister Modi has done in trying to attack what he calls the power elite. And this is cutting across professions, not just in government, but in media, in cultural institutions, in research, etc. Is that this would also harm India in the long run. Because how do these people become the elite? They become the elite because they've come to positions of influence. And when you attack them, when you go after academics, after judges, after intellectuals, they run away. They leave the country if they can. They, all of you want to go abroad and study. You know, how many young Indians are going away? I have, in fact, a whole chapter in my book called "The Secession of the Successful" that draws attention to the flight of the elite. Everybody wants to go abroad. So that is damaging the country. How many people want to remain in this country and work for India is a challenge. But the second reason I talk about the Cultural Revolution is that the unlike during Mr. Vajpayee's time, after all, he was also a BJP leader and he ran a BJP government, but he was a consensual politician, like Narasimha Rao, like Manmohan Singh. He took everybody along. So he did not alienate those who were influential in the country. Even someone like Amartya Sen was given Bharat Ratna. You know, uh, Modi's style has been to say, if you are not with me, you're against me, and just you know move them out. And that is not, in my judgment, in the interest of the country, which is why I use the metaphor of the Cultural Revolution. Finally, your proposition that Modi came to power because of good governance in 2014 and 2019, you're right about 2014, but not about 2019. If you saw the election campaign of 2019, they were the BJP was on the defensive on the performance of the economy. The economy has not been performing well. They were on the defensive on issues relating to even corruption. The whole focus became nationalism and Pakistan, Balakot and terrorism and nationalism. So they fell back on a staple, which ensured, improved performance.
Well, you raise an important question, sir, that, is the present younger generation of the country thinking about solving India's problems by being here, or even if they are outside, if they are abroad, are they really devoting their mental resources and other resources towards solving India's challenges? Sadly, the answer is not an emphatic yes. Though I would say that, my opinion as a young person who would, be traveling abroad for studies is that if things change little bit in the country towards allowing people of younger generation to step into the world of politics or public policy, I'm sure a lot of people would come back and they would want to contribute towards change, and not just contribute towards election campaigning after every 5 years. And they would want to be over here for a longer period of time and solve the real challenges after the new government is, elected and brought to power. Now, my next question is, sir, about Delhi's architecture, because an incident about Pragati Maidan, it finds mention in your book, and it's a very interesting discussion because, as myself a Delhiite, I do cherish those buildings, albeit a lot of them are colonial in character. So in the context of the present government pulling down Pragati Maidan's, iconic Hall of Nations, you write, and I'm quoting, that the new social set that has come to power in Lutyens Delhi has no such aesthetic sensibility. Referring to the present government in its, pulling down the structure. But I personally find it to be a bit unfair in, let's say, singling out this particular government. Why? Because most of the post-independent political leaders, in my personal opinion, they have not had that great sense of aesthetics towards, designing, urban architecture. Primarily because maybe, the Indian Republic in general has made surprisingly few contributions, towards public architecture. And a lot of cities, they're still dependent on colonial era structures for their basic work. A lot of bureaucrats have complained about how crampy and not so friendly are the offices of North Block and South Block in terms of discharging their duties and doing their work. And maybe, rooted in a socialist mindset, a lot of initial urban planning, households, they went for a mechanical structure, which turned out to be grim and unaesthetic. Shastri Bhavan, Rail Bhavan, they are in stark contrast, to buildings that we have had on Rajpath. So I would say, and in fact, there was an interesting India Today article that called such, structures as temples of socialist Raj that are now becoming slums of market economy. So why single out the present government when almost every political leader in the country has not had a taste for aesthetic buildings?
That's a very good question. First of all, I'm not singling them out as far as aesthetics is concerned. I'm drawing attention to a phenomenon which is political. Because if it was only about modernizing Delhi, I think the process would have been a far more transparent process. I think the main criticism is that the process has not been transparent, and we don't know why everything is being done in a hush hush manner, and therefore there's a lot of questioning. But there's a larger issue. I have no problem pulling down Shastri Bhavan and Nirman Bhavan. I agree that they are highly overrated structures. But you take something like Jawahar Bhavan, which was built in 2005, 2006. It's a new building. It's a modern building. It's not an old building. Uh, so that raises political question. Is it being pulled down because it's called Jawahar Bhavan? Will it continue to be called Jawahar Bhavan if something comes in its place? But I think the larger issue, and many years ago in the Times of India, I wrote a column called, um, Democracy's Taj Mahals, and argued that every politician wants to leave behind something that people remember him by. And like Shah Jahan is remembered by the Taj Mahal, that every politician wants to have a few, foundation stones, inaugural stones all over the place. So, and imagine that, 100 years from now, somebody will see his name. And a lot of activity, political construction activity, infrastructure activity in this country has been about that. I mean, we are one of the few countries where politicians open, flyovers in cities, put down plaque with their name on it. You travel around the world, see how many flyovers will have a foundation stone with the politician's name on it. Right? Everything is a extension of the political leader's personality. And I think what is interesting about the Central Vista project is this extension of the personality of the new regime, that you want to leave behind something that the future will remember by. So, in that sense, my criticism is cuts across political parties. It's not specific to Prime Minister Modi and his government. I think this is a general affliction within the Indian political class, that they all think of themselves like Shah Jahan, and everybody wants to leave behind a Taj Mahal.
Well, that's interesting because ultimately there are a lot of real governance issues which, if our politicians collectively cutting across political parties solve, they'll be definitely remembered for that. And I hope that the political discussions and narratives and incentives, they are formed on the basis of those real governance issues, and maybe after solving them, one can always lay down strong inaugural stones. My last question to you, sir, would be about India's future in general, and the specific question within that broad realm is that the book talks about caste, class, and other social groupings, and its impact on India's politics and economy and society. With groups come group identities, and group identities compete with individual identities in a society. So my question to you is, how do we create an effective Indian state that focuses more on individual identity of the citizen in terms of governance and delivering justice than group identities? Because if it becomes a competition between either various group identities competing in terms of getting the attraction of our political class, or even a conflict between group identity and the individual identity, I'm sure we are not going to solve our governance issues at all, because ultimately the state needs to realize that for it, every individual citizen is more important, and the subject's individual identity should take precedence over his or her group identity, be it affected by religion, be it affected by caste or class. So how do we contribute towards creating an effective Indian state that prioritizes and sees its subjects as individual citizens?
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer because, and it's certainly not something I discuss in my book. So it is not a subject I've really thought too much about. But, to give you a kind of top of the mind reply to your question, I think, first of all, the Indian Constitution is based on a recognition of individual identity, of individual freedom. Adhering to the principles of the Constitution is an adequate, guarantee that the individual's rights are protected. The problem with governance is when you do not adhere to the principles of the Constitution and override the principles of the Constitution in the name of group entities and make group interests more important than individual. That is where politics interferes. So go back to the Constitution. The only group identity that the Constitution recognizes is the protection of the social social rights of the Dalits, of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Beyond that, the Constitution does not recognize anything else which is defined in terms of groups. It recognizes everybody as an equal. Second point I would make is that the politics of the country has to also focus on the improvement in the standard of living of every citizen rather than looking at citizens as groups. I mean, the fact is that we are a country of enormous diversity, and all of us have multiple identities. It's not as if we have only one identity, which is that of our individual self. Our identities are defined by our mother tongue, by our religion, by our region. Several factors define our identity. That's the reality of India. You come from a particular region, all this defines your identity. And you eat a particular kind of food. I mean, recently I wrote the column saying that, look, we keep we keep forgetting that even our basic thing like food varies region to region. I recognize myself as someone whose staple food is rice, and you may be, wheat eating a person, for all you know. So this is the diversity of the country, which is defined in terms of various group identities, and we must respect that as well. We can't run away from that. I mean, even a kind of more evolved democracy like the United States has come to terms with these group identities. You're black, you're Hispanic, you're Asian American, you're African American, you're white, you're Catholic, you're Protestant. All these are important political identities in that country, and therefore we cannot, run away from the reality that we have to deal with.
Right. For the state to practically prefer individual identities or look upon citizens in terms of their individual identities, they need to take inspiration and need to adhere to the theoretical source of it, which is the Constitution of India. Uh, Personally, sir, it has been very, let's say, lucky for me. I've been really lucky that, whatever questions, candid questions that came to my mind and candid thoughts while reading your book, I have been fortunate enough to, ask the writer personally about it. And I would definitely want to extend this opportunity, to members of the audience. And I would like to tell the audience that anyone who wants to ask sir a question can do so through a raise of hands. Before that, We have one question from Yash Pahel, who had pre-submitted the question. And Yash, please go ahead, unmute yourself, and you may ask Mr. Baru the question that you had filled. Do we have Yash? Uh, we are facing some audio issues. Your voice is not clear. There's a lot of noise in the background.
Somebody else has raised a hand.
Okay, let me ask the question from Yash's side. He had, written out the question in the form. His question is very basic, and it is something that we, would be, and it's important to discuss this because it keeps affecting the governance, every now and then. That how can India reduce its perilous wealth inequalities when 1% of the country's population has a very strong control over majority of the resources in the country?
Yes. How, you need transparent public policy.
Right.
It's not just one person, it's about half a dozen people who own a dominant share of the total wealth. In fact, I have some numbers in the book which you can look at what percentage of the population owns 80% of the total wealth of the country. It's from memory, not probably more than 2-3%. You know, and you need a strong government that can enforce anti-monopoly legislation that can prevent oligopolistic practices, that can enforce transparent pricing. You need a competition commission that has got teeth. I mean, we created a competition commission, replacing the Monopoly and Restrictive Trade Practices Commission. It's called the Competition Commission of India, but it is understaffed, toothless tiger. So you need to empower all these institutions so that they are able to take on the big guys. And taking on the big guys has become a challenge across the world. You look at how Europe, for example, is struggling to deal with the power of Microsoft, to deal with the power of Amazon, and all these big American firms. And today, right now, as we are talking, the whole problem of intellectual property rights in pharmaceuticals, American big pharma is opposing a waiver of IPRs for COVID vaccines when the whole world needs these vaccines, and but not willing to waive the IPR. So you see the power of big business is universal, and this has to be a fought at every stage in every country, so that democracy is not simply going and voting once in 5 years, but democracy is in fact equality of all.
Right. So it's, you underscore the importance of institutions, and as history has shown us, only those revolutions have been successful which have been, let's say, followed up, by setting up of good institutions. Just as, let's say, freedom revolution or struggle was, one such period. We now have Akash. Akash, kindly unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question. Akash Aggarwal.
Uh, good evening, sir. Akash here. So my question to you is that, like, aren't we talking very much idealistic things these days? Like, don't you think that world has changed for good? Like, for good or the worse, the world has changed, and we are now living in a world where everything is very much open, and people are directly opposing things, and like nothing is hidden. Like it's all in front of us, and we have to make very simple decisions. Like one need not to read much today. Like they can see what is happening. Like everything is quite visible. People are taking sides clearly.
I'm afraid that's not true.
So
We live in a world of what is called fake news. How much of what you see clearly is real? How much of what you read on social media is true? I mean, you have lots of people who are exposing fake news, and a lot of innocent people are misled by fake news. So you imagine that you have a lot of information at your disposal, but you don't know how valid this information is. And if you are not then adequately educated and aware of different sources of information, and think only what appears on your mobile phone is the truth, then you will live in a fool's world. Look at the United States. United States is supposed to be the richest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, technologically the most developed country in the world, and yet it has a significant movement of people who believe that God created the earth, that this theory of evolution is all nonsense, that one day God came and created earth and created man and put man on the ground. It's a movement, and there is something called Christian Science, and people who believe in all of this. So you are in a world in which people do all kinds of non-scientific nonsense and think that's the truth.
Right, sir. In fact, adding to that, a lot of people in the US, they still continue to believe that Democrats are a bunch of, pedophiles who have hidden children in some, underground basement. And that topic actually became a serious topic of discussion, in the last US elections. Next question we can have from Rohan. Rohan Yadav, would you unmute, please? Yeah, Rohan, kindly go ahead after unmuting, please.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah, perfect. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good evening, sir. Sir, my question is that we are talking about class differences, we are talking about caste and religion, etc., etc. What I feel is there is one more thing which is coming in future, and it's technological differences. We can see there are people who have access to a very advanced technology, and there are people who hardly have any smartphones or anything to access. So do you think my question is a bit abstract, so how are these things going to affect our society in future? How technological difference will create a, a, a social stigma or maybe a social panic between those who have an access of technology and those who don't have an access of technology? Thank you.
A very good question, and there's a lot of literature now in the last few years about digital inequality in societies. We are not the only country, but in India, the problem gets accentuated by two factors. One is income inequality, and the other is educational inequality. Because if you do not have access to income and you do not have access to education, you do not get access to technology. It's as simple as that. And the only way in which you can deal with this problem of digital inequality is to bridge the education gap and the income gap. So, I mean, we have seen during COVID, all the better off children from better off families going to better off schools, they've gone through this entire year with, what is it called? Home learning based on what we are doing right now. I mean, Zoom calls. The teacher calls on your laptop, and you sit. Your mother sits with you. You learn on your laptop or on your iPad or whatever. But if I don't have a laptop, if my family is not rich enough to afford a laptop, if I'm not denied access to that technology, how do I then attend a class? And that has become a huge issue today in the last 1.5 years because of COVID. We have created, suddenly, due to just this one factor of the closure of schools and teaching happening digitally, electronic teaching, we have created a huge social divide between those who have access to the technology and those who do not have. And this is going to have an impact in the future.
But the way things are moving, like we can't see this difference between this education inequality and income equality being reconciled anywhere. It is looking like people are not, the government is not at all paying attention to how to improve the education system of this country, and things are not being spent in an appropriate manner. So how are the means, what I mean to say, sir, if all these things continue this way and the differences keep on occurring, we will be in a very, I mean, in a very, in a situation where things won't, you know,
you will be in a politically and socially unstable world, and that is a price we will pay for not creating adequate opportunities. you know, that is a challenge. I mean, today, if you ask me, finally health has become a priority for political leadership across the country because of COVID. Everybody now talks about healthcare. How many people were focusing on healthcare before this pandemic?
No
Right.
one was.
Similarly, education, the quality of education. We have tolerated millions of Indians leaving this country over the last 25 years because the educational opportunities are not adequate here. And Indian children are going all over the world, not just to United States or Australia or United Kingdom. I know that going to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Bangladesh to study because in India there are not enough good colleges, right? So we are forcing our young to go out. Now, at some point, all of this will, erupt. Like the pandemic has created a huge health crisis, there would be some social crisis as a consequence of a frustrated youth that does not find adequate access to education, adequate access to employment. Those things will come up.
Okay. So next we have Harshita, and just telling you a little bit about her. She's my junior from SRCC, wherein she did her undergraduation, and after that she went to IIM Ahmedabad, and she's just done her MBA this year, and she's graduated from IIMA. Yeah, Harshita, go ahead, please.
Hello, sir. It's a pleasure having you. And I just completed your book. It was a phenomenal read.
Thank you.
So,
Thank
a
you.
lot of the conversation or the flow of the book was around the us versus them ideology, be it being Mr. Modi from the state versus center, or be it across terrorism. And I couldn't help but draw parallels between this sort of idea and with Noam Chomsky's propaganda model and the common enemy that is leveraged by state to create a sense of fear. So, do you think that India's power elite are now the common enemy for the intermediate class? Like, what are the points of difference or similarity over here? I was just curious about that.
Well, another very good question, and I have to think from top of my mind because it's not an issue that I have actually discussed in the book. But thinking as I speak, I would say that one of the arguments I end my book with, in the very last chapter, if you read, I raise a question that is the targeting of the existing elite genuine, or is it a way of masking the problem of what we have just been discussing: inequalities, economic inequalities, social inequalities? That what are the real problems for India? In my judgment, inadequate healthcare, inadequate access to good education, inadequate employment opportunities. These are the real challenges. But by talking about Lutyens Delhi and talking about Khan Market gang and by talking about this elite and the business elite and the cultural elite, are we diverting attention from the real issues? I end the book with a question. I don't have an answer. I mean, in a sense, your question mirrors my question. But I would rather that you think about it than for me to give an answer, because it is entirely possible that what we see as this great battle in Delhi between the old power elite and the new power elite is nothing but a shadow play. It's a mime where you're doing things in order to actually, or even this, this Central Vista project, new parliament building, new this building, new that building. I mean, is that our priority? Why are we not saying we should have more new schools? Um, you know, um, Better public transport, drinking water for every family across the country. What are our priorities? So I think it's important to ask whether these political battles that we read about in the media every day, are they the real battles of the people of the country, or are they diversion from the real battle? That is how I end my book. I leave it as a question. Even today, I will leave it as a question. You're all bright young people. Think about it. I mean, the future is yours.
And I think so that also is there because when you used to be, into the field of journalism, I think journalism was, of a very different nature, and therefore whatever was discussed, was very much important for the country. And we actually used to see battles happening in a very intellectual way through opinion pieces instead of, let's say, what has come down today in
Now
the
we have
field of print
abuse.
ads. Right.
Now on Twitter, it's all abuse. You don't agree with me, you abuse me. I don't agree with you, I abuse you. That is the debate has come down to that level.
Right. Right. Uh, so before moving on to the next question, I just
Well,
want to.
it's 10 to 6, it's 10 to 7 now, so I guess we're coming towards the end.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we just have another three questions.
Okay.
And my apologies because the
No.
session was supposed to end at 6:45, and we just request for another 10 minutes to extend the session. Next question is from Nihal. Nihal, can you hear me?
Yes,
Kindly
very well.
unmute yourself and you can go ahead. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Sir, I wanted to understand how do you think the government can manage the people's sentiments and communicate better, especially during this COVID crisis? I mean, people's sentiments play a huge role in the governance. Uh, and most likely it has been a one-way communication, it seems, for this government, not a bilateral. So, what do you think can be done here?
Well, this is a serious problem. It's a topic I have not written about much deliberately because after all, I I spent about almost 5 years of my life working in the Prime Minister's office doing this, and I didn't want to come out and say, okay, I did it better than what the guys after me are doing. So I've deliberately stayed away from writing about this. But since you've asked the question, let me say that the essence of uh, governmental communication is that it should be transparent. That's the essence. People should, even if you're playing a game, and often governments do play games, I'm not saying they don't, people have to trust you. They have to believe you. They have to believe that you're telling them the truth. This is very, very important. So the credibility of communication. In fact, I teach a course on politics of public policy at the Indian School of Public Policy, and one of my lectures is on this topic of the credibility of communication. Credibility of communication is extremely important for the legitimacy of the state and its institutions. The problem with this current regime is that everybody looks at everything they do through an ideological prism. If you are with them, you believe them. If you are against them, you don't believe them, right? And that has created a problem of credibility. So if you're a supporter of Narendra Modi, then you believe everything the government says, unquestioningly. If you are not a supporter of the government, you disbelieve whatever they say. But you cannot function like that. A government has to be a government of all. Even if political parties contest elections against each other, when they come to power, they are running a government for all citizens. And when there is, for example, you take the current public health crisis of COVID, if we had credible communication through professionals, not through
Right.
politicians, doctors telling the truth and giving us sound advice, people would feel happy. What has now happened is because there is no credible communication from the government, every TV news channel is interviewing this doctor and that doctor and going all over the world interviewing people. You don't know how many of them know what they are saying, how many of them are qualified to say what they are saying. Should you wear one mask? Should you wear two masks? Should you wear a mask at all? Should you wash your hands with soap or should you wash your hands with something else? There's so much confusion. And all of this was avoidable if you had practiced professional and credible communication. And I think one of the problems that we now face is that, for example, in UP, by arresting people who are, tweeting about what was happening, you have created a situation of fear. People are no longer telling you what is happening. So you needed a Barkhadat to go all the way from Delhi with her camera to show all these dead bodies on the river. You know, why is it that rest of the media is not focusing on these things? So people say, oh, media is scared. Media doesn't want to tell what is happening. I know what is happening. I see in my neighborhood what is happening. But if this is not appearing in the media, then you say, oh, this media is sold out or corrupt or programmed. So there is a problem of credibility, which is a serious challenge, and I have no idea how this government intends to get over it. They began with enormous credibility in 2014, and we have seen a systematic dilution of that credibility. And incidentally, I'm not only blaming the central government and the BJP. Go to states. In state after state, we have authoritarian chief ministers who put people cartoonists in jail. So there is a serious crisis of communication, partly because of the corruption of the system, partly because of the, as we said earlier, the decline of mainstream media and professional journalism, and the rise of this fake news business, and partly because of authoritarian leadership.
Yes, sir. We next have Sanjay. Sanjay, keep the question short kindly, because we would also have one last question after it. So just keep it very short, and then we can move on to the next question. Sanjay.
Sure. Hello, sir. It was good interacting with you. My question is based on the dominance of caste and caste system in North India and South India. They are both different ends. So how do you see this problem? And do you think separate policies for each region would be a solution for the same?
Well, first of all, caste is a national. I mean, I don't think there's such a significant change regionally in terms of the relevance of caste as a political institution. The composition is very different. You have a larger percentage of, say, Brahmins in UP than you have in Tamil Nadu. But other than the composition, caste composition of the elite, of the power elite, I don't think the caste itself is very different from one country to another. But on the second question, sorry, what was that? What was your second question?
So do you think that separate policies for each region
sure. Okay. Yeah, I got it. Well, that is the essence of it, the governance system in this country. If you look at the constitution, see, almost everything that you need from the government is handled by a state government. Education, health, power, water supply, urban, maintenance, sanitary, urban governance, municipal administration. What is it that you want as a citizen? It's a state government. So therefore, across the country, there are different state governments, and their job is to deal with the local demands. Empower state governments, empower district administrations. That's the only way in which you can improve situation. It will vary. Then some states are better governed. They have modern leadership. They have more capabilities, better infrastructure. Others are less. So this kind of regional inequalities will happen. Many years ago, N.T. Ramarao, when he challenged Indira Gandhi in 1982, made a famous statement saying center is a conceptual myth. So very famous. And Manmohan Singh, as Prime Minister, used to often say this. You say, what powers does the Prime Minister have? Basically, Prime Minister is Foreign Minister. Essentially, if you look at the day-to-day job of a Prime Minister, the Prime Minister is nothing more than Foreign Minister. He deals with the rest of the world. Because every other subject is actually a state subject under the Constitution. There are two other subjects where the central plays an important role. One is defense, and the other is home. But both become important if there's a problem. If you have a war, then the defense minister becomes an important entity because he has to conduct the war, right? Or if you have violence or terrorist attack, etc., the home minister becomes important. But on a peaceful day, in fact, when Chidambaram became home minister from being finance minister, I went to see him around 11 in the morning. So I said to him, I took an appointment. I went to see him and I said, look, I just have 5 minutes of work if you don't mind. He said, no, I have no problem. All my work is over. I said, what? He said, yeah, I come to the office at 9 and 2 hours of work. What else does the home minister do? Unless there's some terror attacks somewhere or some problem somewhere, there's no work for me. And the rest of the day, I'm meeting people. So on a peaceful day, the home minister has no work and defense minister has no work on a daily basis. I mean, they may have work on some days, there are meetings, etc., etc. So on a day-to-day basis, the real work of governance is at the state level. It's state chief ministers, state ministers who are actually responsible for everything that you and I need. But because the center has money under the whole fiscal, the federal fiscal system that we have, the center collects all the money and then redistributes it to the states. And the center has one power which the states don't have, which is the center can print money. So if it falls short, it can print money. States cannot print money. That is what gives the center power. The last question.
Yeah, Yash, would you just like to ask a very short follow-up question to the first question? So he wants to ask, something related to how to solve, the 1% controlling X% of the resources problem. He's saying that we need to go beyond creating strong institutions. Yash, would you just like to make a short introduction, please? Okay, he's muted. That was his question, sir. That maybe we would need something more specific, and that's purely out of his concern for the country. Thank you so much, sir, for actually engaging with us in this discussion. Readers Cafe is actually a group wherein majority of the people either are public policy enthusiasts themselves or they want to read more about it. And it was very educative for us to have one of the most senior policy practitioners talking to us. And we wish the best of health to you. And we look forward to reading more books and engaging on more discussions on those books in the future. Thank you so much.